Why do you choose horror as your genre of choice?
I love the dark side of things. You can escape from things, but you can also address issues. When Edgar Allan Poe died, Rufus Griswold was the one who came and wrote that obituary. Oh, isn't it sad that this poor, horrible, alcoholic, terrible, depressed man had to live this.
If you're watching like a horror movie, they have lots of different methods in scaring the viewer. How do you make a horror book horrifying to the reader?
I'm a firm believer in
After many technical difficulties, we are here again at the Writers Are People Too podcast, where I just can't get writers to stop talking about themselves. Tonight, we have with us David Allen Voyles. So, David, go ahead and tell me a little bit about yourself, please.
Right. Well, I am a retired teacher. I got into writing really later in life, in my 60s, after teaching for 30 years. After running a ghost tour business for 3 years, that was pretty interesting with a 1972 Cadillac hearse. So that gave me a little bit more of a push for telling ghost stories. But I'd always liked ghost stories. But when we shut down the ghost tour business right prior to COVID, I decided I would turn that energy into writing and seeing if I couldn't publish some of these stories. So that's kind of my history of how I got into writing.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and you had mentioned you're an English teacher. Just before all the technical difficulties happened, I was busy singing all the praises to all my English teachers in the past, and telling you to not let it go to your head, because all my English teachers were my favorite in the past. But nonetheless, would you say that you got your interest in Edgar Allan Poe, and we'll get to your book in a second here, from the ghost story aspect of it, or from the English literature aspect of it?
I probably would have to say from the ghost story angle, from the supernatural. I think I even, like many people that read early in life, I read Poe pretty early in life, and I like those stories a lot. But I found since then, Poe's not easy for many readers. For one thing, the language is really archaic. So even though he's great at what he does, it's really a challenge for a modern reader, especially modern young readers, to get into Poe.
Mm-hmm.
So but I like spooky stuff. That was really the attraction to me all along, was all the spooky stuff. So that seemed like a natural. As it turned out, I'd always been intrigued with the idea, especially later in life, with what happened to Edgar Allan Poe at the end of his life. That was really the story that I'd intended to tell. I wanted to look into the last 10 days to 2 weeks of his life and imagine some of the things based on all the information that we have of what might have happened, because nobody knows for sure exactly what did happen. But that last period of his life was fascinating to me. So I finally got to the point where I thought, I'm ready to do the Poe story. I've been wanting to do this for 20 years. I've written other things. I've written collections of ghost stories. I've written 2 little novellas. But it's time to do the Poe story. And when I sat down to write it, a different Poe story just forced its way out. It wasn't the one that I'd intended to tell all along. I still want to tell that story, but instead it kind of came up with, I don't know, something forced its way out about what if Poe's scariest stories all came from the idea that real things that happened to him when he was 15 years old living in Richmond, Virginia, those were the things that inspired him to write these stories later in life. That one became intriguing to me, and I ran with it. So that's what Edgar is really about.
Yeah, and it's always interesting how writing the stories that we write morph as we get into them, because that'll happen to me too. I'll come up with like an idea or an outline or something, and then I'll get 3 chapters in and it just completely changes. And I mean, that's part of the creative process. But as you mentioned, your book is called Edgar, and you've tagged it a horror novel which imagines one terrifying summer in the life of Edgar Allan Poe when he was 15 years old. So I haven't actually read too much Poe. I actually did memorize The Raven when I was in college. I loved that. I love the cadence of that. It takes like 5 minutes to recite. It's crazy long.
Yeah.
But what's some of your favorite stuff from Poe?
I think that the stories, mostly the same favorites that other people have, with The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Fall of the House of Usher, those just are, they really resonate well with a lot of readers. And so those are still my favorites as well too. And I had to incorporate them into the story. So I didn't want to retell the same stories, but I did want to touch on them and say, okay, what if they had a weird way of how they actually had worked into his life at that point? So then I touch on some other stories that people don't know, like Morella or Ligeia or Metzingerstein. These stories that people don't know. A humorous piece called Conversations with a Mummy. They're not your standard pieces, and people don't need to know them. And that's another thing that might be of interest. If you know Poe and you're familiar with some stories, great, you'll appreciate it. It'll be like Easter eggs when you're reading this one, but you don't have to be that familiar with the stories to, I think, appreciate Edgar.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned 5 or 10 short stories and a couple novellas and stuff that you've written. Why do you choose horror as your genre of choice?
That's a really good question. I've just always been fascinated with it, and Halloween is my very favorite time of year. It always has been. I love the dark side of things, and I think the more as an adult when I look at it, the more I think about it, it's that we live in scary times, and they seem like things are much more frightening than the things that I write about. But you have control over the horror that you write, and I believe that as a reader, the same thing is true too. It's still a little bit distanced from real life, so it's an escape. And yet, like any fiction, and I, being a teacher of literature, I've always had a love for literature because you could experience everything all over the world, all kinds of possibilities about the world through literature without having to actually go there. So you can escape from things, but you can also address issues. And I think Edgar, this 15-year-old boy, when I read about him, I had to imagine a little bit about the real life struggles that he had, which he had quite a few as an adopted child. And I wanted to work those into the story as well. So it just
Mm-hmm.
has all the richness, there's just so many possibilities with it. And I love to get the little, fireside chills, telling a story by the fire, that kind of thing.
Well, the way you phrased that earlier kind of leads me directly into my next question, which is like, is this a historical fiction-esque, or like, did you do research around Poe to come up with plausible plot devices for what's happening to him, or is this all your imagination?
That's a really good question. And I did quite a bit of research. I don't know that that was really my intent. I wanted to be able to be free to imagine what happens to him. But I really did do a lot of research, and lots of the things that are in the book, if people again know Poe, or if they want to look up about Poe, they'll find out that those things are really true, and they're amazing facts about Poe that I never knew. For example, we all know that he was adopted. We know that most people know, if they know anything about Poe, know that his birth parents were actors, but they died early in his life as just a toddler, and so he was adopted by John and Frances Allen. But that there was a stigma about being the child of actors. And his father, John Allen, I don't think ever got over that. Frances Allen I think she really was close to Edgar, but there was always a bit of friction between Edgar and his father. And I wanted to bring that out in the story a good bit more. Um, this isn't really a spoiler in terms of my story, so I think it's a fact that's fun to share and that people didn't know. But John Allen actually had another family on the side. He was a polygamist. He had family with children. And Edgar found that out about the time that I'm writing this, about 15 years old. So that even added
Mm.
to it. When Edgar was finally able to go to the University of Virginia, and then later he went on to West Point, he was always struggling with his adopted father, John Allen, for money. And a lot of people talk about how Edgar, he got into all this trouble. He was an alcoholic and he got kicked out and he didn't, squandered his money. Well, he was constantly trying to get money for the tuition and for books from his father, who would not give it to him. And then Edgar
Mm.
found out that there's another whole family whom he's supporting at the same time. So that just added to the friction. So that was a neat thing. It's not horror, but it was an interesting fact that I was able to incorporate into the story, and I thought it was really neat to put it there. And I'd like for people to know that really did happen. So at the end of the book, when I finished the last chapter, I added an afterword, thinking some people might like to know that question, like how much of this was made up and how much of it was real. So I kind of spell out a few of those things, talked about where I got inspiration, how it fits into Poe's stories, chapter by chapter, and a little bit about the true things. He has two friends in my book, Edgar, and they were real friends of his in life. Um, the true love of his life, in my opinion, Elmira Royster, instead, not the Virginia that we all know about. I think he loved Virginia and that was fine. But Elmira Royster, he met about this time when he was 14 or 15 years old. And they were so in love, they planned to get married. Even though Edgar was going off to the University of Virginia, they were going to get married. But when he left, Elmira's father didn't like the fact that Edgar was the child of actors. And so he killed the relationship by holding the letters back. So Elmira never got them. He didn't get letters from her either. His father had killed those. So they went their separate ways, thought they'd each been dumped, got married. And at the end of Edgar Poe's life, he comes back home to Richmond. She's a widow. He's a widower. They get back together again, and they were about to be married again right before he died. And most people don't know that. And that's an incredible part of his life, I think. You know, a tragic thing. There's so many tragedies about Poe as a figure, even after death, when he got buried and things that happened to his grave. I mean, they're just incredible things that just kept happening to this poor guy. So when I could put those into the story, I really wanted to do that. And I did add a little bit of that in the afterword that people could read about if they wanted to find out more.
And you know, as you're telling me these stories about Poe's life, I see constantly in stories about creatives, whether they be like artists or musicians or writers or whatever, the struggle internally with struggle, like trials in their life, and then also substances. I'm always seeing that in creative individuals. They're just trying to figure out how to get through life and how to express themselves through their art. Going back to what you were saying, you kept telling me about his he was 15 or so. Would you say that this is like a coming of age story?
It is that is definitely part of it. It is one of the threads that goes throughout the story. It would be a coming of age because to me that's part of the character arc for Edgar, for my book, is that he does need to find out who he is. What does he really want from his stepfather? Is he willing to stand up to his stepfather? Is he going to go with his father's desire? There's kind of a constant little bit of a conflict there too about John Allen's business as a exporter and a importer and a warehouse man, whether he wanted Edgar to just take that over, and the fact that Edgar might have wanted a life in the arts just again added more to that friction. And Edgar would have to decide, which way do I want to go? To whom am I going to be true? Edgar did want, he craved affection. He craved acceptance. And I think it was very, that's why he could accept or take on so much of what John Allen was dishing out. But ultimately, he's got to come to terms with who he wants to be. And it is then a coming of age story.
Mm-hmm. So what's the main source of conflict in the novel then?
Well, on the personal level, you've got definitely that conflict with his father. But in terms of the story and the actual plot, there, right away at the beginning of the story, Edgar meets his nemesis. He's got a figure that is his doppelganger, really, another Edgar, who's actually supernatural in origin. And no one else necessarily understands this. Edgar realizes that this character is there, doesn't know why he is out there, but it was the series of terrifying events take place that it seems like this creature, this ghoulish creature, who can appear to look just like Edgar, he has orchestrated these things for Edgar. Edgar doesn't know why. But as the story moves on, it becomes possible that this other Edgar wants to take over our Edgar. So I kind of refer to a dark Edgar and regular Edgar. But that, I think, kind of reflects that struggle that maybe all of us have. That there is a darkness, there is a dark side for all of us. And how we deal with that dark side is just a fascinating thing. So with Poe, though, we definitely want to think about it because here the reputation is for him to have had, such a miserable life. But I think he probably did have a lot of happiness in his life. He had to experience a lot of death. A lot of people that were close to him died. A lot of the women that he loved died. That seemed to be a constant pattern. And you see it in his, it's reflected in his stories. But I think there was happiness in his life too. But we get the main idea of Edgar basically because of his rival who wrote his obituary, Rufus Griswold. They hated each other. And yet when Edgar Allan Poe died, Rufus Griswold was the one who came and went to Edgar's stepmother and got all the materials, all the things that Edgar had kept. And then Rufus Griswold wrote that obituary that was kind of, oh, isn't it sad that this poor, horrible, alcoholic, terrible, depressed man had to live this. And so that's the image that we have of Edgar. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily entirely accurate.
Yeah. Don't let the people that hate me write my obituary. We'll just leave it at
that. That's a good rule to follow, I think.
So when I was reading your Amazon blurb, at the end of it, you kind of alluded to this doppelganger, and you alluded to the fact that is the Edgar Allan Poe that we know today actually the Edgar Allan Poe, or is he the doppelganger? I'm not going to make you release any spoilers, but is the doppelganger actually like a character that we get to know in the book? Is he walk me through that? Is he an antagonist?
He would be an antagonist, but he is a very mysterious antagonist. So we keep seeing glimpses of him throughout the story as these other events unfold. So they really are just in short pieces. And so we, like Edgar and his friends, are trying to figure out, what is this guy doing and what is he? They become convinced because they have seen evidence of this creature when Edgar really wasn't there, and they figured out that Edgar's telling them the truth and they can believe him, and they've seen enough of the other supernatural things that have taken place again to believe Edgar. So he is real in that sense for the storyline, but he is very mysterious. There's really a question as to what this guy is. And I would play with an idea. I don't make this obvious there, but if there was a discussion group afterwards of people that were reading it and they were asking me about it, one question that I probably would refuse to answer, but I just like the open-endedness of it, is, well, which Edgar did win out? And is it possible that even Edgar Allan Poe created this entity? It came from himself. And can we create negative energy? Can we create something? Is that where some of the supernatural stuff even comes from? There's the idea of a tulpa, energy that comes when enough people believe about something that it then takes form. It's like the possessed doll. I forget what its name is.
Like a manifestation kind of thing.
Yeah, it becomes the manifestation of that fear, of that whatever many people would say, evil or whatever. But I like that idea. I think it's kind of, I don't want to say for sure that that's what it is, but I like throwing it out there as a possibility.
There's a couple things you've mentioned and you haven't quite put your finger on it. So I'm curious if I'm reading into this the wrong way or if you intended this, but is there sort of an unreliable narrator thing going on here? Maybe not unreliable narrator, but what do you think about unreliable narrators in general, especially how it relates to like horror stories?
Right. Well, since I did not write in first person, I did write it in third person. But I leave that open, and it still is often limited. It is often still limited to Edgar's, whatever his perception is, and it is, we are with him a whole lot of the time. But I can understand and deliberately leave it that way, that the reader will have questions about the reliability of what's taking place. You'll get a little bit more of a feeling like, okay, I accept that this is the storyline because this third person narrator has said that these are the events that took place. So I don't think there'll be quite that question as there was in Poe's Telltale Heart, for example. Where that narrator, true, I am mad, but, or true, you've said I'm mad, but listen to how carefully as I tell you all the things I did to show you I'm not mad. And yet he is mad. Of course he's mad. So it isn't to that degree, but I like playing with that a little bit with Poe. And so I don't mind that the reader will question, like, well, what are we supposed to think? Did this really happen? And for quite a while through the story, you might wonder, well, do we know that these things happened? I don't want to get too far into that and answer that question specifically, but I like it being a question.
Yeah, you got to leave a little bit of mystery, want people to buy the book, right?
Yeah, I think so. Plus, I just like open-endedness to some degree. I think that's fine. I know that's frustrating because after teaching literature for years, students would often be, I can't think of a particular example, but they would often be upset if they like, well, what did happen? Well, what is the answer? And so that open-endedness would sometimes drive people crazy. And then they went on to math class where they felt like they could get answers. But
Yeah, see, I hated that though. I love the ambiguity of it and coming up
yeah,
with my own solutions.
yeah,
I
yeah,
hated
me too.
math and I loved English.
Yeah, me too. That was exactly my point.
And hey, that's why we're artists and not mathematicians. So,
That's right.
you've mentioned a few times this doppelganger seems to play a large role in the story. But what other kinds of supernatural things are in the story?
Well, one thing that happens that I think people that have read it really it resonates with them and what they really like is the character of Morella, who is a one-eyed black cat, but she can communicate with Edgar. And there's a mystery about where Morella came from. She just appears and somewhat adopts Edgar and appears as a companion, but also as a guide for him as they navigate these adventures together throughout the rest of the story. So that's a supernatural element. Is what is this deal with this black cat, this one-eyed black cat called Morella? Um, there are elements of ghost stories, of the traditional ghost story that I kind of bring into it that are even more than what Edgar Allan Poe did. But my take on the Telltale Heart. If you know most people will know the Telltale Heart, and they'll recognize it when they come in, when they read that part in the story. But it takes place in a totally different way. But there are enough elements from that story there that they'll relate to. But it is, in essence, a ghost story. That chapter is there. The Fall of the House of Usher I bring into it, and I had always been intrigued with the idea in fact, when I was in college, I was reading different interpretations of what Poe might have been doing with that story. And one interpretation I read, I don't really accept it, but I found it fascinating, was that it was a vampire story. And so that,
Hmm.
the sister who is, rising from the grave, if you remember the Fall of the House of Usher story, it's, the narrator comes on a rainy night into this, mansion, and Roderick and his sister Madeline live together in this old mansion, and she dies, but she comes back out of the grave, out of her tomb in the house. So I revisit that story in a different chapter of the book. But I did kind of want to play with the idea of vampire, but even that I wanted to put a spin on. But it definitely is supernatural. Um, there are, let's see, what other kinds of elements of the supernatural are there. There is a huge dream sequence that takes place in a hotel. Uh, and it, again, the question becomes, did he dream it or did it really happen? But, it is literally a dream, but it's very important about the things that happen in that section of the book. Um, and he sees the figure that he's been this doppelganger all along, but he has an experience where going through the halls of the hotel, they change in color each time he goes down a different hall, and they stretch endlessly, impossibly, like a Lovecraft, thing. It's where nothing makes sense anymore because the halls just keep going and keep going and keep going. But as he passes through open doors in the hotel, he sees glimpses of his life in the past, in the present, and then those people who know about Poe, there's scenes that he sees of his life to come, yet to come. And I feel like that is kind of an interesting thing that happened, even though it's dreamlike, it's still a supernatural element to it. There really aren't any other supernatural beings that I bring into the story as such, except there are the elements of the cat and there is a raven. A raven does appear too at times during the story, and it's kind of a little bit of a harbinger of ill things to come. Once he sees the raven, he knows some stuff's going to happen. It's going to hit the
Hmm.
fan.
So, if you're watching like a horror movie or something like that, they have lots of different methods in scaring the viewer. How do you make a horror book horrifying to the reader?
I do. I'm a firm believer in an appreciation. I'm appreciator, to make that a word, of atmosphere. So I really like that better than jump scares. For haunted houses at Halloween, the commercial ones that you go to, I'm more about wanting to go through them when there aren't even any actors in them. I want to see the atmosphere that you built there. I did that, in fact, with a best haunted attraction, I think, in the country. called Haunted Overload up in New Hampshire. About 2 years ago, my family flew up just to see this one because I've been following it for some time. They're smart enough to know that you can do different types of tours. You can have a daylight tour where there's absolutely nothing going on, but you get to see the beauty of what they've made. It's kind of outdoors and indoors as you walk through. I don't know, it's probably maybe just a couple of acres, but it seems like it's much more. They have a nighttime tour that has all the sound but no actors, and you kind of take your time through that. And then they have the traditional jump scares, all the actors, all the chainsaws. Well, that last one is the least favorite for me. I want that atmosphere. So to me, that's what you do, and my stories are that way. And there may be readers who don't like that. They want to have much more action, much more fast paced. Although I think it's paced pretty well, but it's really about that atmosphere. I really like the creepiness of it. I want that odd tingling feeling that you get when you're walking through it and not knowing what's going to happen or what's all going on. But it's not the jump out in your face thing. It's not the big axe uh, murderer that jumps out from behind a door or behind a tree. It's the atmosphere. That's what it's all about for me.
Awesome. Did you want to read an excerpt from your book?
Yeah, I'd love to. I think what would maybe be the best is just right from the beginning and how this whole
Whatever you
thing
want.
starts for Edgar. So yeah, I'd appreciate it. I'd like to do that. Okay, chapter 1. The eyes in the chiseled skull looking back at Edgar felt as empty as his heart. He dropped his pencil and sketchbook onto the grass beside him and leaned back against the tombstone. Coming to the graveyard to write poetry and draw usually gave him a sense of peace. But that morning, after yet another argument with his adoptive father, he felt incredibly sad. The sound of a bird's raucous call nearby caused Edgar to look up. A blur of dark wings disappeared into the foliage. From the corner of his eye, he thought he saw something larger move. Hello? Is someone there? Edgar stood and took one cautious step toward the small mausoleum. Its walls were so densely covered in ivy, the stone was nearly invisible. Edgar took another step, but stopped when he heard low laughter, or more precisely, someone trying to stifle a chuckle unsuccessfully. Robert, is that you? I warn you, I'm not in the mood for one of your pranks. Edgar unclenched his fists and crossed his arms, subconsciously assuming the exact same posture as his father hours earlier. Edgar. The hoarse whisper was muffled. It echoed as if it came from within the crypt. Edgar edged his way cautiously over to its entrance and saw the iron gate protecting the wooden door stood unlocked and ajar. The stained glass window of jewel-toned abstract shapes kept him from being able to see inside. The sound of more laughter behind the thick door made Edgar's skin crawl, but his unease was quickly replaced by anger as he imagined how his friend would tell the story later. Edgar lifted the iron latch on the door and opened it slowly. He found it difficult to see in the gloom of the crypt at first, but soon he could discern what appeared to be covered enclosures built into the walls on either side that likely held caskets. As he stood in the doorway with the sunlight spilling around him into the dusky room, his breath caught in his chest. Something crouched in the far corner. At first, it appeared to be an inhuman creature, one of many that inhabited Edgar's dreams. But when it stood, Edgar saw it was a man, a boy, actually, a few years from adulthood like himself. This person wore clothing like his own and was of similar height and build. As he smiled at Edgar, the grin grew horribly wider and wider, like the grin of the skull I was sketching. Edgar thought the boy must be mad. And so we meet, the boy said in a hoarse, soft voice, barely above a whisper. The speaker tilted his head oddly as he smiled, which sent a shiver up Edgar's spine. But then an even more horrifying realization struck Edgar. The boy looked like him. Exactly like him. Edgar shut his eyes tightly at the sound of crazed giggling bounced off the stone walls, enveloping him like the gloom and wrapping him in its cold embrace, so he no longer felt the warmth of the sun on his back. When the laughter faded, Edgar reluctantly opened his eyes and found he was alone. Edgar spun in the doorway and desperately searched the graveyard for movement, but seeing nothing, forced himself to turn back and look again within the crypt. With his heart pounding, Edgar stepped further into the mausoleum and made his way to the back wall where the boy had been. No sign suggested anyone had been there. The stone floor was clear of any dirt or dust, so the absence of footprints meant little. Edgar left the crypt and shut the door and the iron gate, frowning for a moment as he paused to stare at the entrance. Shaking his head, he made his way back to the spot where he had been sketching. He picked up his pencil and book from where he'd dropped them and stood, surveying the gently rolling hills of the cemetery as he pondered what had happened. A movement to his right caught his eye. A dark shadow streaked low along the ground before disappearing between two tombstones. Edgar's eyes searched the adjacent crosses and statues, not sure whether he hoped to see the figure again or not. A small, dark shape caught his eye as it jumped up onto the top of a low, flat stone bearing a bronze plaque. With relief, Edgar saw it was a cat, solid black except for a small patch of white on its chest. It lay down on the warm stone and licked the top of its paw, which it then used to clean its face and right ear. Abruptly, it stopped its cleaning and stared at Edgar. "What's wrong with its face?" Edgar took a step toward the cat, but it jumped down from the small memorial and ran quickly off through the cemetery and into the nearby woods. The familiar pang of loneliness that swelled in Edgar's chest was overwhelming.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, any final comments before I let you go?
Well, just that the book is actually out there. The official book launch is October 9th in Asheville at Malaprop's bookstore. We have an event where people can come, and I'll be signing purchased copies of the book that you can get at Malaprop's. You can also order them online and have them ready for you to pick up at Malaprop's for those folks that are in the area. But for those who are not in Asheville, the book actually is available. I had to make it available on Amazon to get the reviews in, early reviews, which I'm thrilled with, have been really positive. I'm very excited about the reviews that we've gotten so far. So it's out there. And if you go to my website, davidallenvoyles.com, you can actually see a fantastic trailer that we just put up, a book trailer video for a 2-minute thing, or just under 2 minutes. That's a really neat, a good job of giving the feel for Edgar. And on that website, there are a number of things you can do, but one of them is to join my newsletter, which I think is a lot different than many author newsletters. I try to include free things for people to do all kinds of dark stuffs, not just my stuff, all kinds of good connections to looking at short free movies, to what other people are writing, where you can find free stuff, and just, fun things about dark stuff. And it's called Dark Cycles. And on Facebook, you can get information about it through the Dark Corners Facebook page, which is named for the podcast I have. There is on Spotify, Dark Corners, where I narrate some of these stories that I've written. And I hope after the new year to get back into it and post some more. There are 3 seasons of stories. One of them is short stories, just all self-contained. And then 2 of them are short novels, 13 episodes each. One's called Witchworks and one's called Wraiths of the Appalachian. But after New Year, I hope to put some more stories out there and have more from the collection of Tales from the Hearse.
Awesome. Well, thank you for all that, everybody. Check out David Voyles. Sorry, David Allan Voyles or David Voyles?
DavidAllenVoyles.com. Full name, all 3 names.
Right.
My Allen is spelled differently than Edgar's. That's an irony there. But anyway, DavidAllenVoyles.com.
All right. Thank you for coming on. Have a good night.
I appreciate it. Thank you.